Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our own image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Being created in the image of God is powerful imagery for humans to hold on to. The question then becomes, how have we participated in this image of God? Richard Middleton suggests the question of how humans appropriately image or represent God is important to explore, since we live in a world pervaded by the violent abuse of human power, often explicitly legitimated by appeal to God's will. Even when there's no explicit appeal to God, humans are religious creatures and tend to consciously or subconsciously to reproduce in their actions something of the character of whatever they take as their ultimate point of orientation and value, their God or gods. Therefore, how we conceive of God and whose image we are created has significant ethical implications. Whether we connect this back to the fall of the angels, as depicted in this portrait by Franz Flores the Elder called The Fall of the Rebel Angels, or as we saw earlier, connecting it back to Adam and Eve, or simply connecting it back, as Creach would say, to the Near Eastern kings who made a declaration of violence and domination. Wherever we root it back to, it is clear that this image that humans were created in the likeness of God has deep connections and ties to violence, which why it becomes important to discuss what is this image and how are we representing it. As Creach puts it, those who bear the image of God are called to practice patience and to exercise authority through an invitational stance towards others. When God decides to make humankind in our image, God truly sets the stage for a kind of life that guards against violence. This act of nonviolence that Creach talks about ties heavily into Christian faith and tradition. You can say it's a kind of goal or way of life to live into this nonviolence and peace and love towards one another and creation, just as God does for us. At the same time, this act of nonviolence is juxtaposed daily through the violence that we see in creation and how we treat one another, and how we interpret the texts in the Bible, tying it back to all the way from Cain and Abel, to how we treat people at the borders today. I think what we strive to be in some ways get lost by how we truly are. And that goes back to the question of what is this image that we are made in? In trying to understand Imago Dei and the role humans play in being created in God's image, the first place to begin is reflecting more on what are the characteristics of God. From the Hebrew Bible to the New Testament, we get many different depictions of who God is. Some that leave us without words, how could God do something like this? To others that reassure us of this loving God that cares so deeply for us and creation. Some of the places that make it harder are the ones that leave us without the words. A good place to really reflect deeper on this is in the Noah story. What was God's role in the flood? How was God's role justified when trying to bring order back into the chaos, which seems to be God's role from the very beginning, as we saw in Genesis 1? So let us reflect a little bit more on the Noah story. In thinking about Noah and the flood in Genesis 6, Creach gives us some ways to think about this particular story that one can argue depicts God as a violent and angry God, or asks the question of, is violence then justified in order to bring goodness and order on earth? Creach would say that we need to take in account the nature of the story. Think about its genre, and this will help us to evaluate what the story is really about and what the story is saying about God. He suggests that the purpose of the stories, like the Noah and the flood, is to present the reasons for creation to continue, and not particularly about God destroying it in the flood. If we follow Creach's approach in understanding God's character through the lens of the Noah story, one could say that God's love for creation and the goodness that God knows it can be is one thing that continues our relationship with God. And that instead of focusing on the destruction, focusing on what is it that God is calling us into. Not a literal throw everything away or rip everything apart and recreate it, but a metaphorical. In what ways are our communities and the faiths that we proclaim going against what God is wanting us and calling us to be in as a community made in God's image? And in the flood story, we see the sadness and the mourning that God faces as God sees how humankind has become. And in creating and choosing to redo what God first intended through Noah and the ark and the animals on it, one would say through Creach's approach, it's loudly stating that this image that God created us in and this character that we are striving to follow the footsteps of is one that calls us away from violence, away from the things that hurt the world we live in and the people that we are with in this world, and calls us to think about how is this naturally destroying or hurting or causing pain in the things that we were given, like our relationships or our environment. And thinking about it in that lens, Creach's lens, one would say that God's character and the image that we came from is one that wants us to continue to reflect, to bring us back to the good and the nonviolence. Establishing God as good and nonviolent, and this image then that we were created in as good and nonviolent is one way to approach what the Bible says about God and what it means to be created in God's image. Moving towards this based on Creach's approach on paying attention to genre and story and what does it say about creation does not at the same time take away the fact that being created in God's image and Christianity and the violent acts in the Bible being used in hurtful and harmful ways. This does not justify the actions. It does not make them okay. Therefore, we cannot ignore the violence done on behalf of biblical interpretation. We cannot ignore the violence that is clearly in the Bible stories. And we cannot ignore our own actions of violence. But with that, this calls us back into what Middleton was talking about. The call of continuing to explore and reflect on the characteristics that we point back to. And as Christians, for us, that is our image of God. Because of the image and likeness of God we were created in. And in that image, recognizing that it is centered in goodness. It is centered in a call to practice nonviolence. At the same time, it is not a justification for the violence that is already continuing to occur and the natural consequences because of pain and suffering and violence in the world. Bringing us to the conclusion that this may be the hardest part of balancing this image of God that we work to understand within a daily life that sometimes is complicated, and without a doubt, violence exists in it. And how we manage that balance of working on our own behaviors that we know need to change and are not good, but also knowing that in the bad, there is something within us because of the likeness of God we were created in that has the possibility for good and love and peace to exist, to flourish, and to be a part of everyday life. And that in all of this, a violent or non-violent God, even though we hope that it is a good and caring and loving God that truly does exist, there's a part that is much bigger than any of us can truly say we understand.